Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second edition of Virtual Breakfast for the season. My name is Jenna Failer, and I am a field crops educator up in the Thumb region. Today, our speaker is going to be Dr. Kurt Steinke. He is an assistant professor in the department handling soil fertility and nutrient management. Kurt, I'm going to let you take it away and share your screen if you're ready.
So again, thank you everybody for being here this morning. As Phil said, I think we have another great season of Virtual Breakfast on tap. It's opening day, so maybe this will be the year that not only do the Tigers win the World Series, but we hit 300 bushel corn and 100 bushel beans all at once. Who knows? So lots of things to talk about here today. So we're going to go over maybe 3 or 4 general topics, and then maybe there'll be a little bit of Q&A towards the end of today. One thing I want to bring up here this morning, obviously, we've talked a lot about this this last winter, would be looking at some fertilizer price volatility. Continues to be a bit of an issue. So we're in better scenario than we were over the winter. I know a lot of you probably purchased or contracted a lot of your nutrient inputs in the fall and winter. So some of the price dips now may not mean as much, but at least we're headed hopefully in the right direction. But I think, you know, on the screen, we get a pretty good idea of where we were versus where we are now. So if you go back even about 2 months ago, we're down about 4 to 6 cents in general for an NP and K. Considerably lower than where we were around last year at this time. So if you look at around that middle column there, about February of 22, that was some of the peak, looking at about 98 cents a pound N, 84 phos, and about 65 cents for potash. However, we tend to forget kind of where we came from even as little as 2 to 3 years ago. So if you go back to about spring of 20, you know, we were still in that golden area of about 35 to 39 cents per pound of nitrogen. Same for phos, with potash a little cheaper. So despite prices being down from where they have been the last 12 to 18 months, we are nowhere near where we were about 2 to 3 years ago. So again, pay attention to what you're applying, when you're applying it, how we're applying it, and sharpen that pencil on the bottom line a little bit with regards to those nutrient inputs. Interestingly, you know, we don't talk about anhydrous ammonia all that much. That's at about 71 cents a pound. So when you compare that to urea, you know, we're pretty equal, which we haven't seen that in quite some time. So I know, especially as you go south of Michigan, there are some producers I know switching over from anhydrous to something like urea. 28 spread is still about 97 cents a pound, give or take. So a little bit considerably higher as compared to maybe something like urea. So could it be time to consider some other sources? Possibly. I think a few of the things we might want to consider, you know, we get caught up a little bit in different sources, how they're handled. You know, there's really few differences in end sources if we handle them appropriately. And so if you're looking at making a switch from 28 to urea, make sure you know some of the pitfalls with surface application versus subsurface application. Some of that will depend on weather conditions, etc. Again, other items to consider if you are going to make a switch, short or long term, obviously pricing. I talked a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. Look at market volatility from both a fertilizer input perspective and a grain commodity crop perspective. If we think that there might be some price drops in the future, whether it's regard to inputs or grain, you might be something where you consider holding back maybe 25% of your N on corn, waiting to see what the weather shows as we hit early to mid-June, or seeing how that market behaves as we go into the planting season. Other items to consider: placement. Big difference between broadcast surface, coulter inject, surface band, wide drop, etc. And I'll get more into that here in a second. Obviously, irrigation, yes or no, can make a difference. That can really affect how that nutrient gets into the plant. And then we get down to the inhibitors. So I still think after years and years of talking about this, there's still some confusion on inhibitors. And so that's one thing I want to touch on here this morning a little bit. When you start talking about inhibitors, we break those down about two different types. We're talking about urease inhibitors and nitrification inhibitors. And so when you start talking about urease inhibitors, those are the ones that are concerned with volatilization. And volatilization occurs with surface applied nitrogen. And so if you are injecting your N, applying N maybe mid-season, it could be on the surface, but if it's later in the season, that corn crop has canopied, you might get less volatilization. Big take-home point here is if you incorporate your N, you probably do not need to use a urease inhibitor. So if you start talking about urease inhibitors, what are we talking about? Those are the active ingredients that are usually NBPT. A lot of us know that as agrotane. There's a newer one out there with the ingredients duramide and NBPT. That's sold as Anvol. And then there's also NBPT and NPPT, otherwise known as Lemus. Those are your main urease inhibitors that are out there. And again, those are aimed at surface applications of nitrogen to prevent volatilization. If you start talking about your nitrification inhibitors, those are a little bit different. Those are aimed at some of those leaching and denitrification losses. All right, and so leaching, that downward movement of N through the soil, and denitrification would be that gaseous loss of N off that soil surface. Now there's a lot of water out there right now, and Jeff will probably talk a little bit about that here in a few moments, but soil temperatures are still relatively cool. All right, and so if you do have ponded water, and maybe you did apply some early N, maybe on some wheat, denitrification is not that big of an issue yet. Simply because soil temperatures are still cool. I think yesterday we finally crossed 50 degrees and it cools off at night. But until we get those consistent nighttime temperatures, that will not be an issue. More of an issue is probably maybe that actively growing wheat crop being underwater. And so again, nitrification inhibitors aimed at leaching and denitrification. Main ingredients there that you're looking at are probably nitropyrin. That's your N-Serve or Instinct, which have been around since 1976 and 2009, respectively. DCD, all right, another popular nitrification inhibitor, and then pronitridine, sold as Centuro, would be another nitrification inhibitor. Then there's also products that have both nitrification and urease inhibitors, right? And that would be aimed at covering all of your bases. Looking at both volatilization losses, leaching losses, and denitrification losses. And there we're talking about products that often contain something like DCD and NBPT, something like Super U, Agrotane Plus, or NBPT and pronitridine, something like Tribune would be another product out there that contains those ingredients. And so that's in a nutshell some of those products. Very different than what we refer to as controlled release N or slow release N. All right, that's a different chemistry of products. Those are not necessarily direct urease and nitrification inhibitors. So all of these technologies are different. I went to some seminars this winter where I think a lot of these were bulked together, and in some cases bulked together with biologicals, and that's not the case. Remember, with these inhibitors, you need to see N loss conditions to see a response to these products. If you do not see N loss conditions, it does not necessarily mean these products did not work. And again, some of those N loss conditions could be too much rain, too little rain. And if you are concerned with surface applications of N, you have to move that N into the soil, and usually about a 1/4 inch of rain will do that. I put up some useful links here looking at great bulletin out there on nitrogen extenders and additives for field crops in that first link, and then use of non-traditional materials for crop production listed in that second link. Highly recommend checking each of those sites out for some further information. Since we're talking about pricing here a little bit, I'm going to throw up the 2023 MRTN's suggested end rates for corn list right here. It hasn't changed from last year, so we usually update this about, I would say every 2 years. We did not update it this last fall winter. We will update it again going into this next growing season. But again, you can kind of see it gives you a take on where crop prices are at versus where we see these end response curves. And again, this table is not simply based on the price of N and the price of corn. It's based on end response trials that we do across the state each and every year. And then we put those data into this database. And then based on where the price of N and the price of corn are at, we can adjust left and right on this table, whether it's worth to apply a little bit more N or it's not worth to apply a little more N. So as you can see with the current pricing where it is at there, as of yesterday, we're looking at about $6.50 corn, 71 cent pound nitrogen, puts us at a ratio of about 0.11. So right around that 0.10 ratio. If that profitability isn't an issue, again, usually the rates circled in red there tend to be more of our non-limiting end rates. So you can see looking at previous crop corn or soybean, depending on if you're in a high or medium to low production soil, that would be that target range that you would want to focus on. Now, I'm going to switch gears here to a little bit on wheat, where we're talking on wheat, when to apply N, that's always the million-dollar question, right? So about 60% of our N is taken up between about Feeks 4 and Feeks 10.1. So we're probably, most of us, just coming on Feeks 4. If not yet, you will for sure probably be next week. 10.1 is where we tend to see that head visible. So it occurs really quickly. Biggest problem with wheat, we always think it's corn, and it's not, right? It grows really quickly, puts on bulk of its biomass in about 3 to 4 week window coming up here real soon. And so with your wheat end timings, soil temperatures dictate green up, right? Not necessarily when we apply our N. So as those soil temperatures begin to warm, that's when those leaf sheaths begin to become erect and tend to become, that green up process then tends to begin to occur. And so the question we always run into is looking at freeze up versus green up N applications. And what do we refer to freeze up? Freeze up would be something like when the ground is still frozen, frost is still in the ground. Usually that last week of freeze ups, the last couple of years has probably been about that first 10 days of March, versus your green up applications tend to be a little bit more that Feeks 5 N application, right? And why is there a difference? Well, it can really influence your other in-season N timings, looking at the number of opportunities for N loss. And your choice, whether you go at a freeze up or green up N application, may impact some of those late season N decisions. Because the reality is, if you look at a freeze up N application versus a green up N application over the last couple of years, it's been about a month difference between the two. And so if you have rainfall, significant rainfall during that month, that can really impact what happens later in the season. So if you look at what we did last year in 2022, we had a study looking at autumn N applications, everything in autumn versus your freeze up versus your green up. We were looking at about September 20th versus March 8th versus April 11th. We looked at those applications in combination with the late season end timing at about Feeks 7. And interestingly enough, what we saw was when we applied all of our N in autumn on wheat, we lost about 10 to 15 bushels. When we applied at green up, we got about a 4 to 5 bushel increase over our freeze up applications. And why? We got about 3 inches of additional rain between that freeze up application and that green up N application, which can make a big difference in that overall N use efficiency. When we applied all of our N, or when we applied that late N at Feeks 7, it increased that autumn only N application by about 16 bushel. And last year, that Feeks 7 increased our freeze up and green up anywhere between about 14 and 18 bushel. And a lot of that had to do with how cool and wet last spring was. Interestingly enough, when we applied and only at Feek 7, about 40 units of N and nothing else, we did get about a 23 bushel increase over our check plot. And so that's something to think about. If we get into one of these wet hole periods, which, you know, we haven't seen very often where you can't get out on your wheat at all. But if we do, as soon as it dries, do get out. That would be more of a rescue N application and try to get that N applied. So we did have a cool, moist spring. 2022 thus far, and I say thus far as of midnight last night, we have received about 5.4 inches of rain since our freeze up N applications on March 8th of this year. So significantly more than last year. So that would be something to think about long term. Some interesting observations as we wrap up here. Looking at what we saw last year with our freeze up N applications on the left and our green up N applications on the right. You know, what I noticed last year when we hit flag leaf stage where we had green up N with the picture you see on the right here, our flag leaves were all bent over versus that picture on the left with our freeze up N applications. That was not the case. And when I looked at some of our tissue testing at the end of last year, we did definitely get a green up N application, had about 0.25 to 0.3% greater tissue end in that freeze up N application. And again, why? It got about, that freeze up got about 3.5 inches more of rain. Soybeans, last thing as I wrap up here, considerations. Out of the 3 main field crops, corn, soy, and wheat, soy considerations, again, don't get a soil test, get a soil test. I think soybeans and soil testing go hand in hand, and a lot of it has to do with potassium. Potassium is probably one of the most important nutrients to think about on our soybean acres, and why. Potassium uptake in soybean occurs early to mid-season, right? So about 70% of your K uptake occurs by about late July, early August. When you look at other soy nutrients, they're only about 50%. So we get a lot of early to mid-season potassium uptake in soybeans. And when you look at K removal in soybeans compared to corn, 60 bushel soybean versus 200 bushel corn, you're removing almost double the amount of potassium in soybean as compared to corn, which is why we talk about potassium so much in soybeans. The other thing to think about with soybeans, look for some of those early plant opportunities. We've definitely seen some opportunities there with yield potential. And again, be mindful of some of those variabilities in response to N applications, because oftentimes we do not see a response. So that wraps up my portion here this morning. I'll stick on if there's any questions here as we go through the weather and a little bit after. Otherwise, I will stop my screen share and begin to hand it over to Jeff.
All right, guys. Thank you for attending and dealing with your RUP stuff. Feel free to check us out on any of our social media. A recording of this will be getting posted as a podcast, and it will be shared across our different platforms following this. Jeff, next slide. That puts us to our Q&A section of the virtual breakfast this morning. And it looks like we're going to start out with one for Kurt. Kurt, using 2 tons of chicken litter for organic corn and 1 ton for dry beans for part of our nitrogen program, would you recommend fall application or spring application to get the most out of it?
Thanks, Jenna. Yeah, I think the first question that probably has to get asked is with fall application is when does it get applied in the fall, right? So if you're looking at fall application of manure, we have to wait till soil temperatures are below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. When they're above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, that manure N can nitrify relatively quickly and then become available without a growing crop in the field. And then it's subject to late fall, winter, early spring moisture patterns. So that's the first thing to be aware of. And you know, a lot of people think, well, if I apply manure in the fall and the soil temperatures are 65 degrees, 62 degrees, I'll just use a nitrification inhibitor. It will not work. All right, you have to wait until those soil temperatures drop below 50 degrees. So if that's not an option, then obviously go with the spring application. Now the thing with dry beans, because they're planted so late in the spring, you know, it's probably one of the last crops to go in the ground. Again, I would probably not support a fall application with that. And so if you want to get the most bang for your buck, it would probably make sense with a spring application. With corn, there again, if you can apply a little bit later in the fall, I would probably wait until spring to get it applied to get the most bang out of your manure application. The thing we do have to be aware of is if we get into one of these dry summers. So if I think back, boy, we had one of the last dry summers. I think it was probably maybe it was either 14 or 16. I don't remember off the top of my head. When we did a lot of our manure applications that year in early spring, it was so dry that summer that a lot of that end did not mineralize, or it mineralized so late that that corn was not able to uptake it. And so that's the pitfall with a spring application, is we don't know what summer is going to be like, right? And so that's kind of what you have to gauge with regards to both that fall versus spring manure application.
Thanks, Kurt. The next one's for you as well. How does soil test base saturation K impact the amount of K to be applied?
Well, that's a very timely question. I think we had a discussion on that the other day. The first thing you want to look at is the quantity of K in the soil, right? First and foremost, without a doubt. And so if you're on one of these sand-based systems, coarse textured soils, CEC less than 5 for corn and soybean, your critical level is 100 part per million, Malic 3K. If you're on a little bit finer textured soil, you get into maybe mid-central Michigan up towards the thumb, where often you get those CECs 6 and above. Critical level for corn and soybean will then be about 120 parts per million. So those are the first numbers you want to look at. CEC 5 and less, 100 ppm, CEC about 6 and above, 120 part per million. That is first and foremost what you want to look at. The base saturation ratio, now there's all sorts of theories, observations out there about cation balance, right? A lot of it has been disproven. I got some great articles going back 100, 120 years showing why cation balance, really may not work or has been studied and really hasn't shown much. So when you look at cation balance, the three numbers you focus on are typically calcium, magnesium, and potassium. So if you look at Michigan, oftentimes your calcium is going to be in that 60 to 80%, your magnesium is going to be in that 10 to 15%, and your potassium is going to be in that about 2 to 5% range. Now, when you look at those percentages, oftentimes I'll look at those numbers to figure out how we screwed up. And literally, if you do something to a field with a cation, could be a potash application, could be a calcium, could be a magnesium, liming application, etc. Oftentimes that's when those ratios then begin to move around. And so if you see that potassium that is outside of about that 2 to 5% range, what happened? Oftentimes right after a potash application, we'll see that number go up, and maybe that calcium and magnesium number will go down. After a lime application, depending on what type of lime you used, oftentimes we'll see that calcium or magnesium number then go up, and maybe that potassium number come down. So that's really when I tend to focus on what is going on with those specific cations in the field, is looking at if they get outside of those ranges, what happened, what caused it to go outside of that range. But first and foremost, you want to look at the quantity or the amount of calcium, magnesium, and or potassium that is in the field, and then look at those critical levels.
Thank you. Jeff, the next one is for you. You mentioned that precipitation for the last 30 days is above normal. If you look at all precipitation since last fall, would be closer to normal?
That's absolutely correct. And especially for eastern portions of the state, which is where that dry area was most pronounced. So that there's no question. If we go back to last fall, even to last summer, late last summer, the trend was actually drier than normal until February, and then we reversed that. So as we see many times, we get an average somewhere closer to normal, but we've never seen normal. We've been on one side of it or the other. So I would also, one other thing that struck me too, looking at the soil moisture, the area of dryness that we experienced in Michigan, especially southeastern lower, was connected with an area to our east over southern Ontario and then into the mid-Atlantic. And interestingly, areas of southern Ontario have not seen nearly as much precipitation as we have. So you don't have to go very far to the east where it's still unusually or abnormally dry for this time of the year. But in Michigan, there's virtually no areas like that left because of the recent few weeks.
All right. The next one's more a comment. You guys knocked it out of the park today, and they hope the Tigers do too. Chris DeFanzo, she put out her black cutworm traps. Their moths have been caught for both black cutworm and true armyworm in Kentucky this week. All your other specialists, if the Q&A don't go the full time, we'll let you chime in here at the end as well with any updates you have. Jeff, last week you mentioned you would share some public weather links you use with us this week.
And I'm still putting that together. I promise we'll do it. We'll fit it in for next week. I apologize for not having it today, but we'll get it next week.
Perfect. Phil, this one may be more for you. Have they changed the numeration for RUP info? Last digits used to be credits and 5-digit number changes per session.
Yeah, that was operator error right there. Go ahead and everyone use that particular number. Send it to me. We'll make sure that it's correct with MDARD. But in the meantime, just use the number that I gave today, and we'll make sure that it's right with them so that you get your credit.
Perfect. Next one, Kurt, looks like for you, with fall fertilizer application, how could you use cover crop to help with next year's cash crop of corn and bean?
That's a great question. So it probably depends a little bit on what you're applying in the fall. One of those things on your coarse textured soils or your sandy soils, again, we don't suggest applying potassium in the fall, saving that till springtime, if at all possible, because it can move, even though it's a cation, it can get away from us. And with regards to fall and then cover crops, obviously, most of us probably could get paid on that cash crop, not the cover crop. And so we don't necessarily need to or want to fertilize that cover crop because it's not necessarily a beauty contest on making that cover crop look pretty in the field. You want that cover crop to do what it's supposed to do, and that might be scavenge nutrients. And so, yes, oftentimes cover crop in the fall can help scavenge some of the residual nutrient that might be left in the field, especially with some of the higher input systems, thinking of something like maybe potato production, something along those lines. But what we don't want is necessarily to apply fall nutrients and then count on that cover crop to scavenge what we apply in the fall and then automatically give it back in the spring, because it does not necessarily occur. So we've done a lot of work looking at both, something like radish mixes in the fall versus some of your more grassy cover crops, thinking of maybe some oat mixes, etc. And there is a difference between those, but just because a cover crop might scavenge nutrients doesn't mean it necessarily will give all of that nutrient back in the fall. So there's a big difference between fall fertilizer application and planting a cover crop to maybe hold that in the root zone and then give it back next spring versus using a fall cover to scavenge what might be remaining in the field so that it doesn't get away from us, and then it may or may not give that back to us come springtime. The thing we got to remember is getting that cover crop to release that nutrient that following year will then depend on mineralizing those tissues in the field, which may not happen until mid to late summer. And so that usually becomes the number one question.
How about if you're applying 2 tons of chicken manure in the fall, as the prior question had asked?
Yeah, so would that be in reference to applying chicken manure in the fall, then using a cover crop to scavenge that?
Correct.
Yeah, so my first comment would be make sure we do not apply it until soil temperatures have cooled off. Because even if you plant a cover, it does not necessarily mean everything will be given back. And again, it probably depends a little bit more on what type of cover crop we're planting. in addition to what we're applying. It's with the unpredictability or the variability in weather that we've seen here in Michigan, probably over the last 15, 20 years. Now it's always been around, right? You can go back to the 70s and 80s and we had weather variability then too, but it seems to be a little bit more common today. It's tough. I would have a hard time recommending that fall manure application, using that cover crop and then giving that back in the spring, especially for something that might need a little bit more nutrient early in the season. Now, some ways to combat that might be if you turn to something like starter fertilizer in the springtime, so you can start right to finish well, get that plant off to a good start. But we know the benefits of manure. We know the benefits of cover crops. We just got to find that right cocktail or that right combination to using those correctly together.
Perfect. Kurt, can you explain the difference between Mehlich 3 versus Bray 1 and Bray 1 equivalent, and more importantly, how to make the decision based on them?
Yeah, so you know, there's been a lot of discussion when we revised the tri-state recs. We kind of switched phos over from Bray to Mehlich and potassium from ammonium acetate over to Mehlich. So there isn't necessarily a right versus wrong scenario here. Big thing to remember is oftentimes if you see Bray equivalent listed, it may have been analyzed in Mehlich and they're listing that Bray equivalent on that soil test report. Difference for phos between Bray and Mehlich would be Mehlich extracts about, let's see if I can remember right, about 35% more P than Bray does. So there's a little bit of a conversion factor. And so critical levels for corn and soybean that used to be 15 part per million Bray are now about 20 part per million for Mehlich. Same thing with potassium. Mehlich 3K extracts about, I think, 13 to 15% more potassium than ammonium acetate did. And so to go from ammonium acetate to Mehlich, you have to multiply by a factor of about 1.13 to 1.15 to get that equivalent. So if you see that listed on a soil test report, something like Bray equivalent, most likely they've analyzed it with something like Mehlich, but we're all used to Bray, right? Because it's been around for so many years and some of us have those numbers ingrained in our head so much, that's where they'll list that Bray equivalent number on that soil test report.
Perfect. Jeff, this next one is for you, but it looks like something that you're going to want to do some research on.
I just was working on that one actually.
Well, perfect.
For Clay.
Maybe you have an answer then.
Not. I think I know what's being referred to, but I'll make sure and have a look at that. But that's an interesting question, and it's one of those surprises that something so far away has some influence on us. But I'll do a little bit of R&D on that one.
Perfect. Kurt, the next one's for you again then. What's the max dry NPK you'd be comfortable with in a 2x2 application?
Dry, so I assume granular is what we're talking about here. So in a 2x2 application on something like corn, typically we can go up to, so it's all about salts, right? And so typically with salts, we're talking about N, K, and S. So it depends a little bit on what you're applying. And you can figure that out with your salt index. And so it's about that N, K, and S number. With a 2x2 application on corn, I think if you look at published figures, you can probably go upwards of 80 to 100 pounds of salt total in a 2x2. Now, do you need to go that high? Probably not. The big question with something like corn would be, when are you going to side dress, if you are going to side dress? And so just remember, your 2x2 quantity, or the amount you apply in a 2x2, a lot of it depends on when you side dress. So if you side dress early, you can probably get away with that 20 to 40 units of N in a 2x2. And early, I would mean V4 to V6. If you go with a late vegetative, maybe an early R side dress instead, then you're going to have to increase that 2x2 N content probably more into that about 70 to 75 unit range. We've played around with years in a dry 2x2. Now, not many people do dry 2x2s. We do them kind of more of as a gee whiz approach. We've gotten away with, you know, in some cases, numbers a little bit higher than that salt number, but you're at the mercy of the weather, right? If it's dry, you might get saltation and burn some of that stand out. And if it's wet, you may not. With soybeans, if you're looking at soybeans, that max salt concentration in 2x2 comes down to about, you know, 60 to 70 units total of N, K2O, and sulfur. So those would be the numbers you would want to aim for.
Perfect. And that was our last question. So I know we're running with 5 minutes left in the thing, but if any of our other specialists are still on and have any updates they want to give, I think it looks like Chris, you're on. Do you have anything?
Nope, just that I'm starting my own trapping, but I'm very particular. I always want to get a 0. You know, I always want to get no moths in that first catch. I don't see any catches out of Purdue yet. I don't know if they've started their trapping, but I'll report next week, or at least have a black cutworm count.
All right. Any other specialists still on who have anything that they'd like to share with us? All right. It doesn't sound like we have anybody else left. So with that said, we just want to thank everybody for attending, and thank you, Jeff and Kurt, for taking the time to speak today and share your expertise. So next week, we will be back same time, same day with Kim Castus talking about forages. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.